Well, that's a unique experience for me, I must say. Slightly scary. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Alastair Driver. Absolute privilege to be here. I flew across yesterday, my first overseas trip for 3 years. It's actually the third year in a row that I've been invited to speak here, but it's taken this long to get here for obvious reasons. But it's a real pleasure to talk to you today about rewilding. There are so many similarities between your Danish situation and the situation in the UK. In the UK, we have a country that is very near the bottom of the world list on biodiversity loss. Our national parks are the lowest grade national parks there are. Agriculture in the UK covers 70% of our land surface, and we are suffering from terrible agricultural diffuse pollution, urban diffuse pollution, over-abstraction, sewage in our rivers, etc., etc. So I'm assuming from what I've heard and seen yesterday that you have similar issues. And I hope that what I tell you about today in terms of rewilding and what it can do, not only for the environment but for the economy, will strike a chord. First of all, I just want to tell you a little bit about my background. If I can get the slides to change. So I had the good fortune to lead a very feral childhood. I lived in the cottage that you see in the bottom right-hand corner, 600-year-old cottage in the Cotswold Hills in Gloucestershire, and I roamed the woods and streams of a very wild countryside in the 1960s. I spent every holiday of my childhood and youth on a tiny island off the coast of North Wales called Bardsey. No running water, no sewage, no traffic, no shops. Every week of every holiday for probably the first 18 years of my life. That picture in the bottom left-hand corner is a picture of our living room, covered in corpses of birds, crab shells, skins of animals all over the walls. My father was a country naturalist and a biologist, and he taught me from this high about nature. So I was a country naturalist, a young naturalist. Actually, I must just tell you that when I was invited again last year to come and speak at this event, I Googled it, and I was shocked to find on the website an image of two naked people running through a forest. And I thought, oh no, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. Naturist and naturalist are often confused. But I'm very pleased to see that you've all got your clothes on, so thank you for that. So, brought up as a country naturalist, and I'm struggling. I'm going to have to stand over here. Sorry, folks. And I had the good fortune to become the first conservationist for the Thames catchment in 1984. And in that role, I had the responsibility of trying to make sure that the Water Authority for the whole of the Thames region not only minimised the damage to the environment through its engineering works, through abstraction, through pollution control, flood defence, etc., but I also had to try to ensure that the organisation, wherever possible, made things better for the natural environment. Sorry, guys, I'm in trouble with this. So, to start with, it was all about, in the early years, it was all about minimizing impact. This is what we used to do to the environment. We used to plaster our rivers with concrete and steel. We used to dredge rural rivers for agriculture, for land drainage, draining the land. And gradually, it was a case, as a young ecologist, one guy with 10,000 staff in the organization, trying to gradually change attitudes. And as we moved into the 90s, we started to move into positive stuff, river restoration, sensitive riverbank protection with natural materials. And I had the privilege to be involved in helping set up lots of projects like these, London Wetlands Centre, big river restoration projects. In fact, I had the pleasure to be a founder member of the UK Life River Restoration Project in the early 90s, which led to the restoration of the Skjern in Denmark and two rivers in the UK. I did that for 34 years. I became National Head of Conservation for the UK Environment Agency, a policy and strategy job, which I did for 15 of those 34 years. And just over 5 years ago, I left. And I left knowing this to be true. Traditional nature conservation, nature reserves, sensitive farming practices, protected sites, good planning legislation, trying to protect good sites, that is not enough to stop biodiversity going backwards. We are still going backwards. I had the privilege to work on thousands of projects in my time, and I was very proud of them, and hundreds of organizations did lots of brilliant things over the last 80 years or so, but we're still going backwards. It's not enough. So we need something else additional, not instead of, something else additional. Keep protecting the special sites, but let's think about what else we can do to actually turn things around. And that something else, in my view now, I'm 5.5 years into this job now, my view is that rewilding is a significant part of that something else. And there is a clear definition of rewilding. The IUCN has a clear definition and set of principles. Rewilding Britain, who I work for, this is our summary definition: the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. And it is very important to remember that that involves restoring natural processes at scale, and yes, where necessary, reintroducing species. But remember, species reintroduction is just one intervention of many interventions that you might need to carry out to kickstart the recovery of natural processes. So Rewilding Britain has an ambition, a target of at least 5% rewilding across our country. But we accept that we also need another 25% of this environmentally friendly, nature-friendly land uses, farming, fishing, forestry, etc. If we were to achieve that, we firmly believe we could turn things around on biodiversity and we could be tackling climate change in an effective way. The important thing to remember is that rewilding represents a spectrum of activity. This graph shows you on the vertical scale management intensity from low to high, and it shows you project size along the bottom. And most of our important nature reserves in the UK are in the top left-hand corner. They're relatively small and they're quite managed. What we need to be doing is moving towards the bottom right-hand corner. But in the UK, and probably, the same is true in Denmark, you're never going to get to the size of some of these amazing, huge sites, Yellowstone, Okavango, these sorts of places. We're not going to get to that. That's not achievable because we don't have the space. We don't have the land. But just to move to the center of that graph, which should be our ambition. That is a massive step to take. We need to move our best sites towards the center of that graph. And now we have a cluster of rewilding sites in the bottom left-hand corner there, the blue sites. We need to be increasing the size of those and moving them laterally across the graph, joining them up, etc. And if we can do that, we will turn things round. These principles are really important. There is lots of debate about rewilding, what it is, what it isn't. These are 5 firm principles that you will find in the IUCN definition, and you'll find on Rewilding Britain website, Rewilding Europe website, etc. First of all, it is about people and communities. It is not about land abandonment. It is not about excluding Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is a species that belongs in the natural environment just as much as a mosquito or a mallard duck or a helleborine. We belong in the natural environment. The challenge is, can we belong there? Can we be there without impacting on the rest of the ecosystem? We need to be working at scale. We need to be working at a large scale, nature scale, so that you can expect to see a response from biodiversity. We need to have the ambition to let nature lead. Yes, we might be intervening quite a lot to start with, to kickstart natural process recovery, but we've got to have that ambition to gradually wean ourselves off controlling. It is linked to resilient economies. It should be linked to resilient economies, and I will give you some evidence from projects to show how that is now working. And we have to be in it for the long term. I describe it as a marathon with a sprint start. So yes, we're on a marathon here to get there. It'll be beyond my lifetime that we achieve what we want from these big projects. But the sprint start is this early intervention. Lots of effort to get things moving. Just a quick plug for Rewilding Britain. This is the organisation I work for. I'm the director. It's a tiny charity. We have about 9 FTEs, full-time equivalents, worth of staff. But I think it's fair to say we punch well above our weight. I've just seen a report on the impact of environmental organisations in the UK. I was literally sent it yesterday. Independent report based on public opinion. And interestingly, Rewilding Britain, 9 staff, finished above the likes of WWF and various other organisations in that chart. So it goes to show that, you know, with a small bunch of really dedicated people, committed, passionate, expert people, you can engender change, you can have an impact. And being small is actually a big advantage. We are agile, we can respond very quickly to media opportunities, to influencing politicians, etc. And my role, specifically, I'm at the moment the only one who goes out and advises landowners and big landowning organisations, government bodies, charity NGOs, private estates, private farms. But I also, because of my past as head of conservation for the Environment Agency, I also have the pleasure of dealing direct with senior politicians. So that is a massive advantage, to be able to pick up the phone to speak to them about policy blockers that are stopping good things from happening. So we're tiny and we intend to remain so. Act as a catalyst. We don't own land and we don't intend to. I think the best thing that we've done in the 5 years or 6 years of the organisation is to establish a Rewilding Network. We started this a year and a half ago, and we now have, actually those figures are out of date now, we now have over 70 case study projects on there, above 100 hectares each, case studies of rewilding. We have approximately 600 landowning members already on the network who are rewilding, and it is engendering massive interest. On our website, please visit the Rewilding Britain website. I would encourage organisations here in Denmark to think about establishing a Rewilding Network. Forgive me if there is already a Rewilding Denmark organisation, but it's certainly worth thinking about establishing an organisation. But even if you don't, existing NGOs who are rewilding could easily establish a Rewilding Network. And on our website, you will see maps of where all the case study projects are. You can go into an individual project and see some basic information and images of that project. What's also happening is that at county scale, say Yorkshire, Devon, Gloucestershire, etc., at county scale, county networks are developing. So we've now got this sort of hierarchical system whereby there are county-scale networks feeding into the national network and sharing best practice. And this now is what the Rewilding Network seeks to do. It seeks to inspire people, to help them learn, share mistakes, share successes, provide more and better evidence, etc., etc. And it's really, really taking off. Now, I'm going to quickly, I'll run this a couple of times, a very quick time-lapse of the Knepp estate, Knepp Castle estate in Sussex. This is lowland England, quite warm, quite productive land, productive in terms of vegetation. But it starts with this farm. Knepp Castle estate was a farm, an arable farm on clay 20 years ago. And this is a good example of what happens in lowland Britain, where you've got a reasonable tree seed source around the edge of areas that you are intending to rewild. So this is all about natural regeneration of trees and scrub and other vegetation from existing tree seed sources. So you have this arable field. Farming was unproductive. They could not make it pay. Year after year, they slogged away, and they barely made any profit. So you have a situation here where you have these arable fields. They broke up the land drains that were formerly trying to drain those fields. They excluded grazing animals, so there was deer fencing around the site to start with. And they let nature take its course. And this is a 15-year time lapse, so just Google Earth images showing you what happened in those 15 years. And you will see gradually scrub starts to appear in the landscape, and that's mainly thanks to squirrels and jays, and indeed other birds as well, dispersing seeds, fruits, etc., out into the landscape, also wind-blown seeds. And then you'll see water starting to sit in the land as the effect of breaking up the land drains starts to have effect. And then turbidity in that water, because about halfway through this time lapse, they let in longhorn cattle, Tamworth pigs, Exmoor ponies, and the deer that they have. And these are proxies for bison, elk, beaver, and boar that we once had. We are starting, I'll come on to reintroductions later, but beavers are coming back now. We do have wild boar. We don't have any bison. We don't have any elk. And of course, we don't have the extinct aurochs and tarpan that these are now proxies for. So this is how things go. After just 3 years or so, lots of scrub appearing, water settling on the land, and then gradually more water, turbidity starting to appear in the water, and you get this fantastic mosaic of scrub, trees, wetlands, and indeed grasslands. There are some areas at Knepp which are just open grassland. Now I'm going to show you this, I'll just run this schematic of how, at a landscape scale, this might go in lowland Britain. And this I would say this is pretty similar to what I've seen in Denmark. This is how it could be in this kind of situation here in Denmark. So this is a typical lowland English scene. Lots of infrastructure, straightened rivers, hardly any hedgerows or trees in the landscape. A classic farmed landscape with relatively poor biodiversity. And if I just run this through, you will see that, very importantly, just establishing blocks, individual blocks, and then working on connectivity, trying to find ways around, over and under existing infrastructure, restoring the wetland environment, the floodplain, reconnecting the floodplain with the river, obviously very important, and also very important, make sure that, we understand this is still a farm landscape. There are still people producing food from this landscape, but there are significant pockets of wildness and significant connectivity through it. So that's what we might expect at a reasonable scale in lowland England, and I would suggest in Denmark. In our uplands, it's a very different situation, and maybe not so relevant to Denmark, but this is a case. This is very relevant to lots of England, and this shows you our uplands are heavily grazed, conifer plantations, which have been there many years and are gradually being removed, moor burning, grouse shooting, eroded peat, etc. And this is how we see things changing in the upland, and it's more dramatic, and it'll take longer, of course, because of the climatic conditions. But this is the kind of transformation that we are seeking in our upland environment in the UK. And yes, reintroduction of certain species. We've indulged ourselves with the lynx there, which we would love to see back, and we probably will see back in the UK in the next 10 to 20 years. So that's what rewilding could look like in Britain. I want to now share with you some facts and information from the project. So just recently, a couple of months ago, I did an annual review of 43 projects for which I've got good data that I've visited and assessed and are included on our website. And these projects constitute something like 40,000 hectares worth of data, so it's a reasonable chunk of land now that is in rewilding in England that we visited and got information for. And first of all, I just wanted to share with you the ownership breakdown. It'd be interesting to know how this compares in Denmark. But approximately 25% of it is owned by environmental NGOs, a similar amount by government agencies, and then a smaller amount that is farms and private company land. You will often see in the media in the UK, not sure about here, but in the UK there's often criticism that rewilding is just for toffs, just for the posh people, the rich who own big country estates, who can afford to do it. Well, that's not the case at all. The fact that it is 25%, actually that is pro rata, the amount of land in the UK that is owned by private estates. So it's exactly pro rata with the land ownership. But there is certainly much more that, for example, water companies could do on their land, and much more that the government could do on its forestry land, etc. And by the way, as we go through these slides, I will include images of rewilding, some of these rewilding projects. I won't necessarily talk about them, but it'll just give you a feel for the flavour of the types of rewilding sites that we've got. This is a managed realignment scheme, coastal realignment scheme, that I was involved in my environment agency days. And it is essentially restoring natural processes in an estuarine environment by breaching a sea wall and letting the sea in. Another interesting thing is that most people think, well, rewilding means no food. Well, that's not the case at all. These sites still produce over 50% of the livestock units that they had before. But what the key change is that you've moved from large numbers of sheep for prolonged periods to small numbers of cattle roaming over big areas. That's the typical change in these rewilding sites. But they do require these large herbivores in order to mess things up, create heterogeneity in the landscape, create this mosaic of habitats. So very significant, but there's no doubt, yes, there will be fewer sheep. But actually, I've extrapolated the numbers up for Britain, and if we did rewild the 5% of Britain that we aspire to, instead of having 34 million sheep in Britain, we'd have 33 million sheep. And frankly, I could live with 1 million less sheep in Britain. Another challenge is, you can't rewild, it's a protected site. It's a Natura 2000 site or a site of special scientific interest, which is our national designation. Not the case at all. Actually, over a third of the sites are protected sites. Our government body, Natural England, the nature agency in the UK, is coming to terms with the fact that actually protecting sites in aspic, protecting them in a current state, is not necessarily appropriate for the future. And that actually they could be a lot more biodiverse if we relaxed a little bit. So we are getting there. It's about influencing policy in parallel with practice. And this 2% of the site in conservation management, this reminds us that if you're rewilding, you don't give up on the very special bits of your site. If you've got some rare orchids or a hay meadow or a breeding curlew site, you don't give up on that. Obviously, you try and maintain that for the time being whilst rewilding the rest of the site, and you will probably see these species starting to move into other parts of the site. So yes, 2% of this land area is still managed. It's common sense. I talked earlier about interventions, and we often in the media get asked about reintroductions of species, but that's just one of many interventions. We're nearly up to 30 different types of intervention, and they include all sorts of intervention. Obviously, allowing natural regeneration of vegetation is a given. You know, if you're not doing that, then you're not rewilding. But there are plenty of other things. The planting of trees where appropriate. Some of our upland landscapes are devoid of trees, so we can't wait a century for them to return naturally. We've got a climate crisis. We've got a biodiversity emergency. We've got to get on with it. So yes, some of them are tree planting. Some are reintroducing species, removing fencing, breaking up land drains, all these sorts of things. Very important. And just on the species reintroductions, it's not all about the big charismatic megafauna that you might read about in the press. Actually, most of the reintroductions are relatively small things. You know, they're butterflies or amphibians or plants, mycorrhizal fungi even. Yes, beaver are particularly popular as they start to return to Britain, but often they're relatively innocuous. The problem is in the UK that we're still not ready yet mentally for these big beasts. But this is a stepping stone towards that. Now, this is really important. This is the bit the politicians love. We have asked all of the rewilding landowners to tell us how many jobs were on the land when it was being farmed before they started rewilding. And by the way, virtually all the sites were farmed before they started rewilding. Farmed traditionally, intensively. And the jobs have gone up by 65% because of rewilding. That's very significant. And this is very early days as well. And these are not here today, gone tomorrow jobs. These are jobs that are here to stay. They're jobs around nature tourism, education, health and well-being, ecological monitoring and assessment, stockmanship. Yes, we still need somebody to look after these animals, this livestock. Yes, they're very healthy, fit animals roaming over big areas. To be honest, every site I've been to, the cattle, the ponies, the pigs are in the fittest, healthiest condition you could ever wish to see, because they're living a natural existence. And there are small numbers in big areas. But they still need somebody to look after them because there's animal welfare regulations, etc., that must, of course, be followed. So there is a stockmanship role. There's often a hybrid stockman stroke ecologist stroke nature tour guide. That job is now starting to become relatively commonplace. It is a thing that somebody can actually be quite expert in several different disciplines. And we're starting to see these roles appearing. And then volunteer numbers. And this is where there's a fantastic link with health and well-being. Volunteer numbers are now 14 times what they were when the land was being farmed on these sites. And increasing from 86 to nearly 1,200 volunteers. And this is, again, very early days. Last year, when I asked the sites, it was 9-fold increase. Now it's 14-fold. I don't know where the end is, but it's still got a way to go. And the links to health and well-being, you know, volunteering, working, probably doing physical activity in a beautiful, healthy, recovering landscape with interesting wildlife returning, obviously has massive health and well-being benefits. The income sources are now very varied. There are many types of income source. The number of income sources increased by about 50% compared with farming beforehand. I haven't got time to go into details, but you know, one thing I haven't mentioned is niche products like gin. The Heppel Rewilding Estate in Northumberland produces the best gin you have ever tasted because they've got their own distillery right there in the converted barn, taking juniper and bog myrtle and other herbals, botanicals off the hill, fresh, straight into the distillery. And believe me, if you ever get a chance, it is the best. So many different opportunities. Often nature tourism is obviously a key one. And I just want to quickly explain this. So people will say, well, how is that affordable? How is it sustainable? Where's the money coming from? This chart shows you where the money is starting to come from. So on the left-hand column, you have out of 43 sites, you have in the middle column, the number of sites who are accessing that type of funding that you see in the left-hand column. So, basic payment scheme, which was linked to CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, stewardship scheme, selling beef, lamb, crops. The figures in red are where those income sources have declined as a result of rewilding, and the figures in green are where they've increased. And you look at the chunk at the bottom, they've all increased significantly. Camping and glamping, education, nature tourism, and accessibility to large grants and donations. That's where the extra income is coming from. That's what's starting to fuel this rewilding activity. And of course, it is useful to know what people think, so we've assessed impacts and attitudes, and all the sites have got positive impacts that they've identified on the local economy. And yes, there are some negative impacts around small agricultural businesses that might be affected if they're reducing grain production or reducing sheep production, etc. But generally speaking, there are more winners than losers. And also, we're gathering information on monitoring and evidence. And this is where the two bits of my job come together. Visiting the sites, finding out what they're doing, gathering information from them is hugely beneficial when I then need to go to the Secretary of State for the Environment or senior environment ministers and say, look, this is why we need to be doing this. Look at the jobs, 65% increase in jobs, 14-fold increase in volunteers, all these new income sources, but also having evidence like this on ecosystem services, flood risk, carbon sequestration, water quality, etc., all really important. So it becomes circular. The more evidence I've got, the more chance we've got of changing policy, the more policy changes, the more that will fuel more rewilding, more gathering of evidence, and so it gradually starts to spiral, and that's what we're just starting to see now. Before I finish, I just want to talk about policy. Now, somebody asked me last night in the bar, I think they're here actually, so what about Brexit then? And I said, get over it, for God's sake. We haven't, but... now, the truth is that in the UK, most environmentalists were not in favour of Brexit, because Europe brought us some fantastic legislation that we would not have otherwise implemented if Europe hadn't required us to do so. So I know from my previous role that that was extremely important. And by the way, did you know that dear old Boris Johnson's dad, Stanley Johnson, was one of the key authors of the Habitats Directive? That is fact. He worked in Brussels as the legal writer of the Habitats Directive. It's hard to believe, I know, but it's true. Anyway, the one silver lining of Brexit, for me, as an environmentalist and ecologist, is that we have the chance to reinvent our agricultural policy and break away from the destructive Common Agricultural Policy, which has just is no good for farmers, and it's no good for the environment, and it's no good for the future. And it needs carving up and recreating. And I would commend what our government is currently saying it's going to do. It's not done yet, so I'm not necessarily over the line yet with this, but we are now establishing a system where we stop paying farmers to produce food. If they want to make money from producing food, of course they do, and should, then that's through the marketplace, through the shop, if you like. We stop giving them basic payments, area payments for producing food, and we pay them for farming in an environmentally sensitive way and creating and restoring habitats. And they absolutely should be paid for that. It's a burden and a challenge, and it's bloody difficult. So they should be paid. And what we're establishing is a three-tier system. The bottom tier, if you like, sustainable farming. That's farming in a sustainable way, obviously, various standard techniques. Some could argue that's business as usual. We have to make sure it's not. It's up to the NGOs, etc., to make sure it's not just that. Then you've got a middle tier, which is like good stewardship, and I guess most countries have got that at the moment. That's what we've got, countryside stewardship. But it's the top tier where rewilding comes in. And so I've managed to negotiate, on behalf of Rewilding Britain, negotiate rewilding in the top tier of this scheme. And it is about landscape scale land use change. And that means farmers have to team up, estates have to team up and restore natural processes at scale. Over 500 hectares minimum. 500 hectares minimum. So that means most landowners have got to join up with their neighbours and do something as a consortium. And the plan is that will receive a bespoke payment. That won't be a payment per hectare. That will be an agreement for your land as a whole, for that land as a whole. Early days, it's not kicking in until 2024. But at the moment, the signs are good. And this is basically what we call a public money for public goods scheme. They call it, the proper name is Environmental Land Management Scheme, and it's delivering these public goods, or flood risk management, carbon, biodiversity, water quality, etc. So that could be the most significant piece of legislation I've seen in my lifetime. And as you can tell, it's quite a long lifetime, so that's quite important. So that's where we are at the moment. Still a lot of detail to be sorted out. I'll just quickly mention a few other things that may be of interest. So we have woodland creation grant schemes. I guess you must do as well. We managed to negotiate last year the inclusion of natural regeneration in the woodland creation grant scheme. So now farmers, landowners are not only paid a certain amount per hectare for tree planting, they're paid the same amount for allowing trees to naturally regenerate in a given area of land, a certain amount per hectare. That's a massive step forward. We didn't have that before. Another one that I'll just flag here is virtual fencing, GPS collars. There are more and more rewilding projects, and indeed nature reserve conservation projects, using GPS collars on cattle to control where the animals go. So you can take your fences down. Now, you wouldn't do that next to a motorway because it's a bit too risky at this stage. Technology is not perfect, but there are sites like the picture shown where they are controlling animals in huge areas, putting a big GPS polygon, programming a polygon around a huge area of the landscape. And the animals, I've seen a video, it's amazing. There was a cow there, and then there was a bunch of cows here in a field, open field, and they put a polygon in the field, and the lead cow, because there's usually a lead animal, the lead cow walked towards it. These cows were mooching around here, and then he stopped, immediately got to the polygon, turned and walked away. And as soon as it turned and walked away, those animals also walked away in front of it in the same direction it was heading. It was really interesting to see. But, it's early days in this technology, but I'm certain that this will become a key element of rewilding projects in the future, because it removes the necessity for infrastructure. And removing infrastructure obviously helps to enhance the feeling of wildness in a landscape. And just finally, very finally on introductions, we are miles behind the rest of Europe because, unfortunately for us, wolves and elk and lynx, etc., can't just walk in. They need to come through the Channel Tunnel or something to get to us. So it's going to be a long time before, if ever, before we see the big charismatic apex predators. But these species, wildcats, white-tailed eagle, pine marten, there are reintroduction programs underway for those, and we're gradually creeping in the right direction. Beavers is the big one, though. Beavers, great ecosystem engineers. And for any fans of the Chelsea Flower Show, we have just got a rewilding garden. I've just seen the photos of it that I was sent yesterday for checking, and we've got a rewilding garden there. If you see it on telly, please look out for it. It's got a beaver dam in it. It's only about, 5 times the size of this sandpit, and it's got a beaver dam and pool and trout stream and watervole burrows and loads of native wetland vegetation. But we are slowly winning the war on beavers. They are coming back, and we will see more across the country before long, which is great news. But I'd just leave you with this message, and I'll repeat. We have a biodiversity crisis. We have a climate emergency. That doesn't mean we fiddle around wondering whether we should do something. We need to crack on and do it now. And there are enough examples out there to show us it does work, and it really does benefit not only the environment, but the economy, humans, and wildlife. So I encourage you to share your news with me, because I need to find out more. Thank you for listening, and I'll happily take a few questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Isn't there a risk of when you, and I see the encouragement of showing that not only is this good for rewilding and biodiversity, but there's also, you won't lose money. So it's a good argument when you meet politicians and perhaps the neighbors of this, but it's also a restrictive argument, because there are situations where, well, you're not going to make money out of this. Rewilding of this area or biodiversity area is still important, even though it's going to be a net minus, so you're not going to make money out of it. So isn't there a danger associated with putting your hat on that?
The money thing relates to the private landowners, and bear in mind what I said: 24% big estates, 12% farms, so 36%, about a third, are private landowners, and that matters to them. So they will all they're doing business and economic modelling, and they all, each one has its own focus. Some are going to get into nature tourism. They're already doing a bit of camping and glamping, but they want to break out into safaris. They want to break out into more people on site at a given time. So they're not, they are thinking, seriously about this. They usually got agents who advise them. Actually, it's interesting, the land agents in the UK are now getting into this now and starting to promote rewilding as a serious option. And you have to bear in mind that the basic payments are being phased out. So the removal, I talked about the basic payment scheme going. That started to be phased out last year, and in 8 years' time it will have gone altogether. So they know that they're not going to get £80 per hectare just for farming anymore. That's going. So that's part of the equation. What's the alternative? The alternative is we do a bit more camping and glamping, or we put some tree houses up, or we do badger watching, or they're all looking at the bottom line. So that matters for the private people. For the NGOs, they're not so bothered about making income. They just need to break even with the budgets they've got. But there are more and more grants and government support for this kind of thing. So don't get me wrong, people aren't diving into it blindly. They're taking a sensible economic decision, financial decision. You can probably see better than I can. Any other questions?
Thank you so much for a brilliant and inspiring talk.
Thank you.
I would ask you to elaborate a bit on fencing, which is an issue in Denmark, and maybe a little bit on the conflicts in the local area that you might have overcome, or give us some tips to.
Yeah. The usual recommendation on rewilding projects is that you take down the internal fencing in your site. There are a lot of fences in the UK. Everyone has fences and hedges around their land. So usually it's a matter of beefing up the perimeter fence if you are going to start reintroducing longhorn cattle or Tamworth pigs, etc. The perimeter fence is where there's a lot of expense. And this is where we're now making sure that we lobby government for more grants to be available, which they are. For example, natural regeneration grant that I talked about. That will pay for the perimeter fencing to allow natural regeneration to keep deer out, but in the long term it will also help to keep cattle in when you're ready to reintroduce the cattle. So removing internal fencing is important. Then but you have a perimeter fence, so then you have the issue around walkers, ramblers, etc. And we have a law, you've got to maintain public footpaths, so you've got to maintain access to public footpaths. So you have to provide gates for people to walk through. That then leads me to where we do hit the wall with moving up the rewilding spectrum. A chap I know, Paul Lister, who wanted to rewild 30,000 hectares of Allerdale in Scotland, quite a well-known rewilding site. He wanted to reintroduce wolves, an elk, he hit a brick wall with the elk because the ramblers who wanted to walk across his land, which is open access land, so anyone can walk, they were opposed to elk, especially in the rutting season, being present. So I'm hoping tomorrow to see an elk site here, and I'll be interested to see how that's dealt with, because at the moment, that is a non-starter. So that's when fencing and reintroductions become a bit of an issue. We have no more time, folks. So thank you anyway. Thank you very much. Great to see you.